So the decision to go to war, the decision we had not wanted to believe possible, had apparently been taken. Erich von Manstein. Now that missiles from NATO countries have been used by Ukraine to strike Russia, Moscow's new nuclear doctrine authorizes President Putin to launch nuclear strikes against NATO bases. Indeed, the Russians have affirmed their right, in principle, to strike the West with nuclear weapons. The question is, will they follow through and launch nuclear strikes? Nuclear war is not a simple matter. It presents, on its own, a psychological problem. The use of such weapons can never be casual, because the last World War ended with the use of nuclear weapons, and the next World War will likely begin with them. Psychologically, the idea of World War forms a kind of barrier. Even the worst human being will find himself vacillating when it comes to starting a world war. In the case of World War II, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's memoirs contain a curious tidbit that few histories dwell upon. Hitler gave the order to begin military operations against Poland at 3 p.m. on the 25th of August 1939. Hitler then countermanded the order shortly after 7 p.m. About this, Manstein wrote, "Every soldier can judge what an 11th-hour counterorder of this kind implied. Within the space of a few hours, 3 armies moving straight for the frontier across a zone extending from Lower Silesia to the eastern part of Slovakia had to be brought to a halt. Not forgetting that all headquarters staffs up to at least divisional level were also on the march, and that there was still a security ban on wireless traffic. Despite all the difficulties, we managed to notify everybody in good time. A first-rate piece of work by the operations and signal staffs. Nevertheless, one motorized regiment in eastern Slovakia could only be stopped after an officer in a Fiesler Storch aircraft had landed at the head of the column in the darkness. Hitler had summoned his chief of staff and said, 'Stop everything at once, fetch Brauchitsch. I need time for negotiations.' Hitler might have vacillated for a number of reasons. His erstwhile ally, Benito Mussolini, got cold feet when the German troops started moving. Poland and the United Kingdom had just signed a formal treaty of alliance that same day. Worse yet, according to British historian A.J.P. Taylor, the state of German armament in 1939 gives the decisive proof that Hitler was not contemplating general war, and probably not intending war at all. Page 218. In other words, Hitler's army was not ready. He was bluffing. Or was he? The psychological question is, in these matters, the decisive question. What goes on in the dictator's mind? Taylor wrote, "Here was another mysterious episode. Why did Hitler pull back at the last moment? Did he lose his nerve? Did the two events of Mussolini's neutrality and the Anglo-Polish alliance really take him by surprise? He himself, with the normal propensity of statesmen to put the blame on others, at once complained that it was all the fault of Mussolini. News of the Italian decision not to fight had stiffened the British just when they were on the point of surrender. This was nonsense. The British did not know of Mussolini's decision when they signed the alliance with Poland." Pages 269 to 70. According to Taylor, there was another reason for Hitler to revoke his attack order. Germany's western frontier was virtually undefended on August 25, 1939. Hitler's bluff was all too obvious. He was caught out and embarrassed. Soon enough, shame itself becomes a factor. Does one launch a world war out of embarrassment? Because one must not be seen as bluffing? Hitler quickly bolstered his western defenses and launched his fateful attack on September 1, 1939. The reason to bring up this not-so-ancient history is to illustrate the difficulties of starting a war at the right time and in the right way. At present, an argument could be made suggesting that Presidents Putin and Xi are planning to escalate the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East into a general world war. In terms of psychology, the question of war guilt has always been of great importance in terms of world wars. And yet, winning a nuclear war depends on striking first. How do you get the moral high ground when you intend to strike first? The destructive effect of the weapons dictates surprise attack. Related to this, GRU defector Colonel Stanislav Lunev once said that the Russian military considers surprise to be the most important factor in war. And this leads us to the next question. What happens to surprise when you have verbally threatened the West with nuclear attack dozens of times? If empty threats are made, again and again, surprise may actually be enabled. When Chinese President Xi Jinping tells the People's Liberation Army to get ready for war, over the course of 4 straight years, The People's Liberation Army has no choice but to get ready. At the same time, America becomes accustomed to this kind of talk from Beijing. Here, instead of a little boy crying wolf, the wolf cries wolf. In fact, the wolf knows that his prey will eventually disregard these oft-repeated threats. The West will say to itself, "Go back to sleep. Those crazy Russians and Chinese always talk this way. They are only bluffing." The question we must ask ourselves is whether we are being subjected to a gradual conditioning process from Russian and Chinese leaders, where we are primed to ignore Russian and Chinese statements about an imminent war. It is hard to imagine a better explanation for the bluff pattern of Russian and Chinese war talk. Here we have a variation on the Russian behaviorist, Ivan Pavlov, and his famous dogs. Only, the dogs of NATO do not salivate when the bell rings. They are conditioned to sleep soundly when Russia threatens nuclear war for the 10th time. Or, on electing Donald Trump as president, the dogs believe the threat of world war has been removed because, as Trump has said, the warmongers in Washington will soon be removed from power. Almost 3 years ago, Putin said, "I am not bluffing," but he was bluffing, and unlike Hitler, he was not afraid to appear ridiculous. It seems that Putin knows he is conditioning the West to disbelieve his threats. He is putting them to sleep by repeating something that begins to sound absurd to everyone. Why should Putin worry about his credibility when surprise is more important? So, we must confront the question of timing. If you were Putin and Xi, would you start World War III before Trump takes office? Or would you play another round of tricks? If the market falls under Trump, if the U.S. economy fails under Trump, what would Russia do? In fact, Russia and China want economic collapse and chaos in the United States before hostilities begin, right? And economic collapse is something that belongs to a more distant future. It is not going to happen before Trump is inaugurated. Furthermore, Russia and her partners need to be ready for war themselves. At present, it seems they have a few economic kinks to work out, especially when it comes to the Chinese manufacture of precision machine tools and spare parts. Defeat Ukraine and fix the economic and technological problems of Russia and China first. Build your economic attack, your sabotage apparatus, your agent networks, and your toxic narratives. That seems to be their priority.